Very warm welcome to the Enjoy Holistic video podcast series. Today we've got David McCready again. We did a show last week, which was really interesting. David, thanks for coming on. But after I sent you the links on the Wednesday, just letting you know that it was all up and live, you came back with something really fascinating. You said that you had died that day in a parallel universe, leaving behind, basically, your wife and kids without a father, which was very
Yes,
interesting.
yes. Well, I think I said I forgot to mention to you during our show that a parallel version of me had died a few days before that. But again, leaving the same wife and kids I have in this world, but no more dad for them. He was gone. uh, why this is also an interesting subject is we rarely have a look into what our parallel versions are up to. But by the very act of doing so, it does give us access to a limited form of free will and an ability to change what's going on in the lifetime we're experiencing. So I hope this is going to be a fun subject for everyone who's watching today, and we're going to give you some eye-opening thoughts of things you'd never even thought about. So why did this perk you up? What interests you about parallel worlds?
Well, okay. Well, the most important, there's two things I want to ask initially. Is like, one of them is how did you diverge, or what was the diversion point between the two Davids to create two significant lifetimes? In fact, let's just start on that. So, what was the point that made these two Davids? I mean, is it true that we have many parallel universe based on every insignificant choice, or is it down to the more significant things that allow branches to happen?
Well, let's start with the latter part of
Yeah.
that and then work our way back to where that diversion happened. What you seem to find is there are many versions of us knocking around. Sometimes if you're a bit tuned in, you can have bizarre moments, such as one day I found myself sawing through a bit of wood somewhere. And I had this feeling that in some parallel world, I'd already sawed through this bit of wood that I was cutting through by hand. And now I was having to do it for a second time, which seemed very tedious, seeing as I had already completed the job. And sometimes you just feel these little bits of an overlap, but mostly we're not noticing it. And what's really going on is the bodies we're in are a bit like characters in a computer game. Ultimately, there's a very high up one of us, one being, a godly being that's driving all of these bodies. And in a simplified way, you could say that it's using different guiding spirits in order to power different lifetimes. So sometimes different guiding spirits have a turn, other times maybe some guiding spirits want to try out some other version of what happens. So if they want to try something else, they can allow the one version of you to be split into two, and you'd get two Ians or two Davids. So in this system, you can keep getting multiple little split-offs. And that goes on quite happily. But this system would probably run out of control, and you could end up with the equivalent of watching a film where the plot's gone a bit boring. So if the plot's a bit too dull, you could either fade out that particular life, or you could converge it back into something more interesting. So by this system, you have what you call convergences, where lives split off. Divergences, I have to get my directions right. Divergences, where lives split off. And then convergences, where sometimes you bring them back together, or perhaps even make them redundant. And whole worlds can seem to disappear rather abruptly because people have got bored of playing in them. There are other more fun options to play with. Or if someone has created a more fun version of Ian, then everyone might want to pick him up at that juncture and have their own turn at taking him forward. So you could get everyone wanting to be Ian and creating multiple versions of Ian and playing it out in what become their own little parallel worlds. Am I making some kind of sense as I describe
Absolutely.
the system?
Yeah. So what happened to the David then in the other parallel world?
Well, to give you sense of what was happening to this one. When I was about, I suppose, somewhere between 10 and 12 years old, one morning I woke up having had a really weird dream, and it was a premonition dream about what it was like to live through a nuclear war. So I, at the time, didn't know what nuclear war was. I didn't know what nuclear weapon was, but I'd seen nuclear explosion, I'd seen fallout, I'd seen problems of radioactive contamination, and I was a really young kid, and I just didn't know what it was. And it took some years of going into puberty and starting to learn about the world when I discovered what I'd seen as a little kid in this dream. And that had quite an effect on this David, because he thought, got to be careful, there could be a nuclear war sometime. And as we got into things like the 1980s, so the environment got very hot again. To just give you a comparison, around about 1962, I think it was, we had the Cuban Missile Crisis. World War III nearly started back then. There were quite a few near misses. Things calmed down a little bit for a while, and then back into the 1980s, we got back into the whole thing of further near misses. And if you want to look up some of the history on this, you'll see that one night in one of the Russian missile tracking stations, they were all ready to say start World War III because they'd had a computer error that night. So we got quite close to stuff. And for this David, what he'd done was literally start digging a hole down underneath the parents' house in case he needed a floor-out shelter in a hurry. And it went off to Irish civil defence and went and learnt about what nuclear war was. And what I mean by went off to Irish civil defence, an organisation called Irish Civil Defence. I was living in time in Ireland, went there, well, delicious, studied in their library. The people who ran the place let me in or encouraged me, talked to their engineers, and after about a year or so of doing that, one day the boss said to me, would you like to become a scientific intelligence officer in Irish Civil Defence? So, like at about 20 years of age, and had now got a place in the equivalent of a government bunker in case of World War III. Now, what happened in our reality was World War III didn't happen. And Irish Civil Defence kind of faded out, fizzled out, didn't do a lot, and stuck to other things that were better at, like firefighting and search and rescue, but the nuclear war side disappeared. But I did always know that meanwhile there was a version of David knocking around who'd actually gone through some sort of nuclear war. Something had happened. And then this year there was just this feeling to go and chase it up and see what had happened to the guy. What did happen? Go and find out the story of how he'd managed to get through that and survived. And at the other end, what was going on was there's a version of David who looks older than this, a lot more worn out. He, in effect, was approaching his death. If you've ever read about Robert Monroe, who was a pioneering astral projection guy, Robert Monroe had found as he'd got nearer his own death, his actual projection skills had got better. And in this parallel world, let's call him David Armageddon, and this guy David Current, in David Armageddon world, he was approaching his death, and this had helped his astral projection skills, and that helped us actually form a link and say hello to each other. So I got to see how he was living, where he was, and also look into a bit of the story about how we even got into that drama and what it was like back then. So what's your feeling of this as I describe this story with a long-winded monologue here?
No, it's really fascinating. So was this, I take it these aspects, these two Davids are part of the same higher self? Or would you class it as the same spirit being just splitting off to have two lives?
It's essentially the same spirit being, but living a different path. That's the best way to put it. It's like you, but taking a different direction that
Yeah.
started to split off, in this case, in the 1980s.
So this another question that comes from this is that you mentioned something about when you were cutting wood or something, you had this realization like you'd done it before, and that sounds like deja vu. So is deja vu, do you think, a recognition of another parallel life? Is that what deja vu is?
Well, I'm not saying every case of deja vu, but certainly that is something that would crop up. And if you're paying attention, you will often notice sometimes you're doing things for the second or third time. It feels like you're going through it again, because in some other world, actually, you've already done it. Now and again, you get that little bit of overlap. You just might get a little glimmer into another cinema, let's call it. If you go to one of these big multi-theatres, you might look into someone else's cinema and just get a peek on the screen.
Because I've always thought with deja vu, whenever it happens, or even happens to people around me, the first thing I say is it sounds like we're in sync with something. It's like I've always maybe I've incorrectly believed that we're in sync with what's meant to happen, but maybe it's just a case of we're in sync with the probability. You know what I mean? More than anything else.
Yes, we are syncing up with other things, and let's take this to a very nice little idea that helps us exercise a modest bit of free will, which is why we're having a lot of this conversation today, because we're looking into more possibilities of what happens if the Russians and the Americans finally did unleash their nuclear arsenal, how life was afterwards there, because that's a nice story in itself. The thing that goes on is you're often making little split decisions. You're pulling off in different directions. And if you can become aware of some of the parallel versions of current Ian or current David, and you'll find they're parallel ones, you'll see some of the parallel ones that look more attractive than the current version. They're having a better time. And wouldn't it be nice to swap tracks into another version of what you're already living? Because if you switch into that, you start to experience more of the life that looks a bit happier. And as you've watched, I believe Bashar is the name, alien guy coming through his sort of his human body on Earth. His name is Bashar. He was talking about preferential decisions. What would you prefer? There are all these choices out there. You've been experimenting with all. Where would you like to focus? What's a preferential version of yourself? Again, what would you think about that?
Wow. I just I know it just makes the universe even more complex, doesn't it? Like to get your head around, and you think we're rendering this reality as it is now, and as complex as that is, and to think all these other multitudes of universe and parallel timelines being rendered. So how, to my mind, or to human minds, it's so hard to try and figure it all out. And sometimes that's when you just have to let go and just it's infinite. You know, when you let it go and say it's infinite, it's all possible, isn't it? But
you can't look at all of them, but after a while you'll find some more interesting ones here in the middle, and other ones the other side. And as you start to become aware of them, you begin to realize how you can make more of the current life you're experiencing right now, how you can tweak that, import some good ideas.
So here's a question. So there's a school of thought in many books. I don't know if you've come across the Michael Newton books at all.
No.
Life. No. They talk about life between lives. So this was a hypnotherapist who stumbled across getting life between life recall under hypnosis. So like past life regression, but he accidentally stumbled on taking people back into the in-between state, in between lives. And over sort of thousands of test subjects, there was a lot of commonality between them. So it wasn't just something being dripped up by the imagination. There was a lot of common stuff here. And one of the things that cropped up a lot was obviously there's the life review. People were getting some kind of life review. Like you're sort of judging yourself, or you're there and you're seeing every aspect of what you you did in that lifetime. But there was other parts of it where people were planning their next lifetime as well.
Yeah.
And so, you know, if you've got the multiple life thing, you know, you're kind of planning multiple outcomes, if you like. You know, it's probably, it must be for, I guess for the soul purpose, you must be more of an advanced soul to want to be able to put yourself through two experiences at the same time. It must be quite grueling for the soul. I don't know.
From a soul purpose, it would be common sense to put yourself through multiple experiences because you have more chance of doing things interesting.
Well, I imagine it must speed up the process, speed up the evolutionary process.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what we're finding here, though, in this current world is bit by bit, the wonderful human beings who are getting born into this world are getting better at starting to notice what's been happening for a long time. And they're beginning to pick up on these parallels and share information between them. And I'll just give you a very quick analogy. Can you imagine if someone took away our internet connection? There was no more Googling things. There was no more looking stuff up online. You maybe had to go to look at books in libraries from a limited selection. How would life be like if someone took away your internet connection? What would it be like?
Well, having got used to it, I think that would be like someone chopping your hands off. But I remember going to the Barbican Library in London when there was no internet, and I used to study all the spiritual books in there. So you find a way, but obviously going back to that would be quite, you know, quite hard.
So what's happening with us is we are acquiring a sort of spiritual or astral internet that's giving us access to many more things, and you still end up with the same stuff, but the quality of connection and the speed of access is so much faster, and it means you can progress more quickly. So here's the next bit of the story that cropped up. Having looked at parallel Armageddon, David, there was a sense of, are there any versions of David who'd done better? And it wasn't too long before we could find a parallel version of David who seemed to be living in California in America. So it was still the same. He'd broken off somewhere around the turn of the millennium. And he seemed to be a much more public figure, living in a nice big house. I live in a 2-bedroom flat. He's got a proper house in California, very modern looking, still the same wife and kids. But there he is, looking quite well. He's even managed to hang on to some nice furniture my late father had, but somehow I lost to one of my brothers. Who some people would say he stole it on me. Other people would say he just took it and never gave it back. And grumbly people would say, "Oh, awful!" But anyway, I managed to lose that. Anyway, let's call him Parallel Plus David. Had managed to hang on to that furniture and was talking to me, interacting with me like we're interacting on the screen today, from an office with that furniture in the backdrop.
Just to rub it in.
Oh, you got that furniture. How did you that?
So what was he doing?
The bookcase. Who got the book? How did he manage that?
So was he a public figure on the same topics or different topics?
Was
he like talking about the same subjects?
He does what I do, just more. He seems to be more organized and has more assistants running around. And not only that, so many of the people I know in this will interact with others. He also interacts with the ones who don't live in the United States, but say live in England. I know in England, he still seems to have found them. So it's like the same people are getting together. And one day I was doing a session with a lovely woman, and we were looking at her, let's call it Parallel Plus version of her. So the Parallel Plus version of her dressed a bit better than the current one and was saying hello and saying she started her day with a little video the Parallel Plus David had made. And she was trying to show us, like sort of put the image in our head. So she had a little tablet and she's saying, it's on my tablet. That's where I look at it. That's where you are. That's how I start my day. Because apparently Parallel Plus David has made some nice little videos to get people started in the morning, which left me with a mild sense of inadequacy.
But did you ask him what was the pivotal point for him to have taken those extra choices? I mean, what made him more efficient, if you like? Was it meeting a different person, or did he have different qualifications in life? I don't know.
Yeah. Well, this indeed was a very relevant question, because it was not only him, but it was everyone else who made it into that parallel version of the Earth as well. So what had happened to them? And found a group effect. We haven't, by the way, looked into whatever happened to Ian, because I'm sure we'd find Ian there somewhere in the mix. For this to be happening now rather suggests he'd be there somewhere. We haven't looked at it today, but I'll mention some other people and the David one. And what we noticed was it wasn't that plus version who just zoomed ahead on their own. In fact, there'd been a little bit of a split where one had zoomed ahead and another bunch had been left by the wayside or died off.
What, literally died off, or just no longer seen, no longer interacted?
Literally died off.
Oh, really?
So when I mentioned the parallel plus version of the woman who in the parallel plus version was saying, look, David, you're on my little iPad in the morning, on my tablet, little video for you to help get me started. Well, in her case, she had had a really sort of tricky moment in her marriage and had a dark night where she decided to live or die. Or was she going to live or was she going to die? Well, one lived and zoomed ahead and one died.
Fascinating.
And what had happened in that moment was she really had to connect with her guides a lot more to choose whether or not she was going to live or die.
Yep.
And in that moment of live or die, well, we got both options. And the one who decided to connect more with her guides, connect more with her higher self, was the one that lived, and she stuck with the program.
And how did she die, though? Was it suicide?
Pills.
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah.
Basically. Took a few pills, poisoned her body. That was the end of that. Which shows there's some built-in redundancy in the system. At least you can split yourself off and one of you will make it.
But her ego personality self will now be living out in the astral.
Well, it tends to get reabsorbed back again, because it's actually still you, and it's actually still played out by largely the same parts of you. So there you go. You see, you're seeing yourself as one person. The bigger you, there's one bigger us, really. But it creates multiple versions, so it can create both David and Ian for the purposes of having this conversation today, and it can create multiple versions of David and Ian and see what happens to them with different permutations, try out, experiment.
So do you think in the planning of a life, people go, let's try an experiment. Let's try one who's kind of mediocre. Let's try one that's average, and let's try one that's got higher abilities, and just put them in the same starting point and see where they end up. Like putting the mouse in a maze and see how they end up. And maybe sometimes the one that wasn't meant to really succeed ends up succeeding.
Yeah, because we are experimental beings. You can't really see what's happening until you try them out and let them live their lives and see what goes on. So in that parallel plus version of the Earth, the woman had decided not to live. There are more characters I had a look at, and they too had very much the life and death one. David, around that point, was in a relationship with his then fiancée, and it was a question in this life. It worked out, he didn't marry her and just moved on without her. But in that lifetime, did marry her, and she wasn't really into all of this kind of spiritual stuff. And we got a few little weird splittings after this. Here's what happened. There's one version of David that got married to her, was trying to do some of this spiritual stuff and astral things, but kind of gave up at it. And he went back to being an engineer, building contractor, drinks too much, got quite a lot fatter than this current David. Sort of alive, but a sort of living death at the same time. That's what happened to him. The Parallel Plus version did get married, and round about a year later seemed to have got divorced. And said, I'm definitely going with it. Spirit life, we're forging ahead. We really want to do this astral stuff. That's the way forward. And then ended up with the same wife and kids that we have today. So it seemed that the getting divorced was part of the making of that character.
Wow. So another question I've got is, I've been reading your encyclopedia and about, humans 2 or humans 1, or some coming back into the past to sort of try and help humanity, or to look in what's going on. What do they come back into? So there's like multiple parallel lifetimes. Is there like a prime? It's like a prime timeline, and the others are more just kind of side timelines of what if, or what do they come?
Despite our grumblings about this world, apparently this one is a really fascinating version. So even if you are grumbly and think it's a crappy old world to live in, from the other side of the fence, there's great interest in it. And just on timelines, there's something to reiterate. We mentioned it in other recordings, but worth bringing back here. There's an assumption that you live forward and become a progressively more and more advanced being. Every life you can become more advanced, get to live in nicer places and have a happier time, and everything will be lovely. When you go astrally exploring around the place, you often find the reverse can be just as valid. And that is, you're an advanced being, you're perhaps living on another world in a body, having a good time, a bit bored, and you say, you know what, I heard these rumors that Earth plane world of 21st century is a fascinating place to go. I want to go and visit that. And at that point, you can dive in and you can become any character that's there. You don't even have to get born into them from the start. You can pick them up from anywhere in their lives. And as soon as you pick them up, that'll cause a little parallel split.
That makes sense. Absolutely makes sense. So imagine the same thing. So if you can come into the 21st century, if you're in spirit, you could say, I want to go back and experience the Renaissance, or go back and experience Egypt and everything. But you're not changing the past. You're just creating a split, an alternate reality to experience. And I guess with those, so you're in there. So you've gone in. You've made that choice. But obviously, all the other characters that are in there, who are they exactly? Because they haven't decided to.
Who's running? Well, now we're having that moment of who's operating these bodies.
Yeah.
Who's steering it? What's going on? Where am I?
Yeah. That's what gets complex, isn't it? Very complicated.
Yeah. But it's starting to put a whole new spin onto it, because you were thinking of you were the main personality, but once you start looking at this, it turns out it's like you're a character in a kind of computer game. Anyone can play you. Anyone can literally download you from the internet and play being it in.
Yeah. So you were talking about the different pathways and going back in time. That's it. Going back in time.
We're talking about going back in time, but not necessarily for us going back in time. There's the possibility we're jumping around from one world to another, and we often have this curiosity about going into more challenging lives and seeing what they were like, what would happen if you dived into a particular life. And I want to go back to Parallel Plus, David, because he often feels a bit neglected. I found when I was researching Parallel Armageddon, David, and also aware of Parallel Plus, Parallel Armageddon, David, was weirdly more interesting than Parallel Plus, David. The guy who'd done it better, really figured out how to do it, had got a really good system running, was less compelling than the guy who lived through World War III. And I was going, that's really weird. And if anything, that left Parallel Plus Dave looking a bit miffed, saying, I'm very neglected over here. You don't look on in here half as much as you go chasing after that other guy. And what was going on were a few dynamics, and one of them was we're a bit nervous about looking at versions of ourselves that are doing a bit better, and we get a bit of natural jealousy. It's quite when you come to do this, you'll run into it right in your face, and you'll go, I didn't think I was, but I can see it now. I was one. There it is. But the Parallel Plus, they would look back to this version and see that there's a fascinating experiment going on that we're living through. And that is, if someone doesn't put us in a life-threatening situation, can we still choose to be bright and connected? Because the people in that Parallel Plus world got there because it was live or die. You either connect more with the other teams of beings that are helping you out, with the higher self of what you are, bring this energy through, or you have a miserable life and maybe even kill yourself at that point. And they had that choice. Now here we are in a comfortable world where no one's put a gun to our heads. Can you choose to connect up in the same way? Because it's still you. You are still capable of doing that very bright, capable life. And I was talking about sort of potential for Parallel Plus Ian, and as we're talking here on air, as we're talking on air, so to speak, live recording, I suppose you call it, he's putting a little sort of hello from the background. He's like sort of merging in the pictures there. And he likes being a zany character. One of the things he likes doing is occasionally wearing wild glasses that are more kind of Elton John rather than anything sensible. He also likes playing with his hair and facial beard color a bit and wearing really wild clothes.
How did that happen?
He likes everyone to look at him. You know, right? People going down the street should always be turning their heads.
Whoa.
And he smiles back at them.
He's obviously embracing it.
He really enjoys being and you can feel the body reacting inside of you. You realize it's something you could do, but just were afraid to try.
I could do it at home, but I don't think I'll be doing it on the street. Oh dear, have I got any of those glasses? Yeah.
So these are the sorts of things we were running up back into. So back to a little story of Armageddon. Well, David, what we also found was he was a survivor of multiple parallel possibilities. So go back to his background. He, at that stage, was in his early 20s. This is just around 1983, 94, roughly. He was part of Irish Civil Defence. He was in the Scientific Intelligence Officer Corps. Like, I think there were about a dozen of them for the whole country, so there weren't many of them. And he was just enrolled into it because he'd spent long enough in their library and knew his stuff. He'd read all the books. So there are lots of manuals the Americans have produced about what nuclear bombs do. So he studied, and he was in there, and they're doing that. So they practiced for what nuclear war might be like and how they'd go off to a kind of overground bunker just outside of Dublin. He knew all the form. And one night, it seemed like the Russians made a mistake and pressed the button, kicked off World War III. I think, as far as I can make out, it was like a Friday night. And I've taken a number of people back on the journey and dropped them into his body, and they can like play him. They actually start creating their own very slightly parallel version of him. But as long as they kind of just steer where that particular version will go, they can live through it again without significantly varying it, and you can relive being him. And he was caught in a situation. He was with the girlfriend that in this lifetime later became fiancée, for Mr. Parallel Plus became his wife all too briefly. But in that world, he just got together with that girl. They're out on a Friday night, out with some family of hers, and they seem to be in central Dublin, just beside the river, which runs through the middle of the city. It's equivalent to being on the South Bank in London, if you've ever visited there. They're in the pub, all laughing and joking, getting late into the evening, and the lights all went out. And they're all standing around there, and the barman eventually says, can everyone go outside and please leave your glasses inside? Not everyone left their glasses there, but most of them are. And they get out on the pavement. It's a slightly sort of damp evening. It has been raining before, and a little bit of clouds here and there. A bit like a sort of spring showers time of the year. So there were these spring showers going on. So there's broken cloud around. And on the horizon, the David character there sees there are sort of flashes like lightning, but longer. And these flashes happen, and he's saying, that's not lightning, that's something much bigger. I've read about it, you know, I've watched pictures, there's not lightning we've got. That looks like World War III has triggered. The whole of Dublin is in darkness, apart from car lights, and that was what you call an electromagnetic pulse weapon has gone off and has knocked out the electrical grid for most of Europe, and Ireland was close enough, so it knocked out such an electrical system. And he's thinking that World War III has just kicked off, and they're basically standing at what's quite possibly ground zero from that premonition dream he'd had as a child. And you have to get the hell out of there. It's like, now. And what we looked at then was on this one, there are a number of parallel versions of this event. There was a parallel version where that David character was at home that night with the parents, and the lights all go out, and he goes to the window and looks out, and then twigs what's happening, and he says, the parents, we've all got to get out of here, we've got to leave now. But you know, old parents and getting them out of the house, not very easy. Back in the one in the city centre, he's saying to the girlfriend then and her friends, we've got to leave now, and they think he's a nutcase, you know. We used to think World War III's kicked off because you see some sort of odd lightning that just lasts a bit longer than you would expect in the far distance. So they don't even want to go with him. Now, we had a few parallels here. In some of the parallels, he stays and waits for them. And one of the parallels, he just says, hell, I've got to go. If you're not coming with me now, we're gone. And some of the parallels, they were at home and tries to get the parents out the door, get them in the car, say, we've got to get out of here. We are basically at ground zero. This is just too dangerous. And having looked through all of them, we end up with one guy, you might say, or one little narrow band of parallels, who's driving like hell out of Dublin on a night, bit rainy, gone through the rain, darkened city, because you can imagine a sort of city where everything's gone out, you've just got the car headlights, and he's driving as quick as he can without crashing, because they think you just got to get out of there. And he's like scientific intelligence officer. You might say his job lies at the Civil Defence Command Post, this bunker, which was outside the city. It's like, that's where you should be now, that's where you've got to get to. That's the procedure for this. And you've got this one guy driving out of there as fast as he can, and the other parallels of him further back down the road. And the nuclear bomb does go off literally behind him. You might say all the other parallels get killed. Yeah. And he's the survivor driving out of Dublin. As if you say, why didn't he take his girlfriend with him? The answer, well, he did, but he died. So we end up with the survival one, with something going off literally behind him. So I'm monologuing here too much.
I'm just fascinated by this version of Earth. So what happened in the post-nuclear war? I mean, was the world completely decimated, or was it something that they recovered from eventually? What was the bigger storyline to that?
So let's have a look at the bigger setup. And all I say is I haven't researched all of this. I've seen some snapshots of it. Where I'm doing this recording from at the moment is near Canary Wharf in London. In that version of the Earth, this is a devastated area that now looks green.
Right.
Middle of London looks more like a crater than the nice little wavy map you see. Devastated. London pretty much uninhabitable, ceased to exist as a city unit. The world went through quite a period. It did indeed suffer a bit of a nuclear winter, so everything got very cold. And the smash up was comprehensive. In that particular parallel world, not only the Americans and the Russians thought about blowing each other up, but they also thought who were the friends and allies of that particular side. So if you were an ally of the Americans or an ally of the Russians, in the space of about a day, you got nuked. It was a war that seemed to start off a bit piecemeal, because the Russians seemed to start it that night through accident more than anything else. And then they started doing things. America started retaliating, and bit by bit, an entire nuclear arsenal got unleashed, with also a strategy of make sure you kill everyone in the process, it felt like. So all the major population centers got smashed up. It was very comprehensive.
So the only surviving places would have been places like up north, like far up north maybe, or Cornwall, Devon, those sort of places? Or?
Well, there's the first thing to say, the survivors of the initial nuclear war, there's still quite a lot of people left, but then the climate was badly affected. It got a lot colder. So also the infrastructure that enabled this bigger population to survive relies on things like oil. And nowadays, for example, in North America, about 3% of the population thereabouts can make all the food for not the rest of the population, plus more for the globe. If you can imagine a country like that, which is one of the bread baskets of the world, being knocked out, then there's not enough food. I mean, even in England, we were fighting for food, enough food, as far back as World War I, when the Germans first had a go at torpedoing convoy ships coming to England. So you can imagine most of the oil resources have been knocked out. A lot of the population is gone, the infrastructure, the operation of it is smashed up. People were reduced to a relatively primitive state and had to begin again with knowledge of stuff, but they had to put it back together with the things you rely on, gone. I'll give you another example. I was doing the same exploration with a woman who lived on Mauritius for a while, and we found a version of her who'd survived the nuclear conflict, because Mauritius, little island in the Indian Ocean vicinity, that survived it. But what happened next was it became a magnet for survivors from other areas, and the whole island got overrun with survivors, just boatload after boatload, many of them looking injured, like burn victims, people who were messed up. All these survivors piled up there. There was no way enough food on Mauritius to feed everyone. And we saw an island where it ran out of birds because people were so hungry. They were eating every last thing they could find, and the population dropped down to a very low level. So quite a traumatic time even there. Anyway, this woman who was doing it with, her version there had somehow survived, looked a lot more grey-haired than the current one of her, and a lot thinner. But she'd done it. She'd got through that adventure. So
wow.
many things.
So are you pleased that perhaps you're experiencing this lifetime rather than that one?
Compared to that one, a bit fatter and a lot more comfortable.
Yeah.
So just to give one of the things I found about that lifetime. So the David of that lifetime, where he passed away, lived in Ireland. He did travel to England, but went back to Ireland. Still somehow managed to find the same Hungarian wife. You remember when I got to see her parents' house in Hungary, it had an underground shelter, or a room that it could be, that was actually an underground mushroom farm beside the house. Because in that country, when you built a house, you'd carve the stone out of the earth and pile it up into a house, and you end up with a big hole beside your house. And then what people were doing was roof it in, and these turned into mushroom farms. So that's how she managed to survive that on the other side of the Iron Curtain back then. Well, back to the thing. So in Ireland, where David ended up and managed to bring her back to, it was a country operating without too many vehicles knocking around. So if you went anywhere, there didn't seem to be at this era short of horses. So there's little pathways where people walk from one place to another, but most of the roads have got overgrown and gone by this time. Place fairly smashed up. And in terms of currency, one of the things I picked up was cutlery could be a form of currency.
Because what's the metal?
Well, you know, no one was making new cutlery.
Yeah.
Was in a barter system,
right?
So it was quite a thing. So in a barter system, you sometimes find yourself paying for things with knives and forks.
Well, yeah, it'd be things people need, wouldn't it? So if people want fruit or vegetables and things like that, we give someone a piece of gold, they go, what am I going to do with that? I can't eat it, can I?
Completely useless.
Crikey.
The thing about doing that when you go looking into those ones is at the same time you expose yourself to trauma because you become these other personalities in a little way, and it affects the person you are in your current lifetime. So careful as you step.
Yeah, well, you can relate to that person as yourself, and you know how that person feels. You know how that person will respond and feel in a situation.
Yeah.
So to imagine that situation happening, I mean, it's quite terrifying. I mean, the only thing that makes it non-terrifying is realizing that no one really dies. But you still have to go through that. Time is slow while you're here. Time might be quick there, and you jump in. Suddenly, you're experiencing everything in minute detail, aren't you?
There's another aspect of this as well to mention. It caused such an amazing amount of death throughout the world. When you go look at that Armageddon version of it, the place is scattered with ghosts. If you're mediumistic and live in that world, and someone I know was quite mediumistic in this world, in that parallel version of the world, she died quite early and then got reborn about 10 years later. So it's now alive again, in it again, but in a much younger body, and born as quite a mediumistic child. You'd grow up noticing there are people hanging around your bedroom at night in ghostly forms, and this would just be normal. It's like, here it goes, right, who's the ghost in my room? But in that world, there were so many ghosts hanging around, it's normal to see them. If you're mediumistic and walk out on the street, it looked like something out of a zombie film, where you can see people hanging around, not doing a lot. And the difference is in the zombie film, they rush over and try and treat you as a handy snack to eat, whereas in that film, they just, that version of it, they just wander around.
Well, I guess a lot of people, their transition was so quick, they really had no time to process whether they, and wondering what's happened, the attachment to the Earth planet. And obviously that whole world had its own levels of the astral. It's, every parallel must have its own stacked versions of reality above it too.
Well, they intertwine again, and it turns out what's going on in one version of the place affects another. We are interlocked.
So that's the next question. So when something big like that happens in a parallel physical reality, is there bleed-throughs of some description into ours? Like, would there be things, you think a nuclear bomb going off is such a big thing, and energetically, would that have an impact in other parallel side-by-side universes or realities?
Well, the thing I first noticed about this one was it's almost like someone had sort of pulled it off to the side because it was just so traumatic. We've been living in a comfy bit of isolation, but as Earth's energies are becoming more connected to things, that isolation is breaking down, and we're starting to become reconnected to the other stories, the other narratives that had been going on in the background, and we're beginning to rediscover them. So, if anything, more of an effect now than it seemed to have been back then. It's like when I'm talking about it, I can feel my body go tense and slightly traumatized. I can feel the effect on you. It's like getting into a sort of energy. It's almost like squashing you down. Whereas here on previous chats we've been having, talking about breathing and connecting. Just try and breathe and connect right now, and you'll see how far you got squashed down in the last few minutes.
I can feel it. Yeah, my solar plexus feels tight as well.
Yeah. You'd feel. Just try and breathe again through. What's it like to come out of what's almost like a scary dream?
Yeah, it feels still quite tight actually, because it's so compelling. You know what? When you're here, you think that something like that could never happen, but to think that that did happen to somebody, or that did happen to you, and it would have happened to me, right? Because I would have been in that parallel world probably as well, wouldn't I? You know, as a young child, a young kid, but I would have experienced it as well.
Well, you were in England, which was not good.
Yeah, and not too far from London either. So probably only 30 miles from London or something like that.
So in relation to you, what would I sense about you in that parallel world? I think you'd have died in the sort of the aftermath of it, because there was a lot of radiation and a lot of starvation, and I think that would have caught you then. But you decided to come back anyway, and I've got you as a young kid back in that world, and it doesn't look smashed up in the same it does now, because there's so much greenery's grown over the rubble. It looks like a relatively green version of the world again.
Yeah.
You decided to come back to have another crack at it in a younger body.
Yeah. Amazing. So what about the concept of, so we talk about parallel lives. What about the concept of experiencing other lives that are not the David or Ian personality? So from the same higher self, other parallel aspects that are not you, if you like, but they roll up into the same higher self. Do you know what I mean by that?
Yes, I certainly do. And once you have a look around, you suddenly realize you're tripping over the existence of it. And I'd put the story this way. Supposing some of these parallel versions of you live on another world, a more advanced world, and they're looking down on the Earth's simulation of life. Because the Earth isn't really a solid place. It's a bit like a sort of computer game in its own way. They know it exists. They know there's another game running, another game in town. And they think, you know what, we're getting to this Lincoln phase. Let's give a little wave. And when you get that little wave from afar, suddenly you start thinking about it. Suddenly you start getting a sense that there is another world out there that you're also alive on. And you already have a picture in your mind of something coming to you. Could you just try and describe what's suddenly coming into your head just at this moment? What was it, that little sort of image like? What was it like?
Oh, I didn't really get an image. I don't know.
You were looking at it and then casting it aside.
I was kind of.
It came out.
No, I was more. I don't know. I guess I was imagining what you were saying, so I kind of visualized the Earth.
What was coming into your head at that moment? What looked like that's what we wanted to capture?
I kind of saw the Earth, but I kind of imagined, I don't know, like almost like big beings looking over it, almost like observing. That's if I had to describe it, but I didn't really hook onto it. It was just something that was going through my mind, but I didn't really hook onto it. But I just saw the Earth and imagined observers. If that makes any sense.
That's good. That's on track. There we go.
Right.
So you're beginning to realize, there was, as you were testing in your imagination what was going on, there was a hint of being looked in on. And it's rather like, in these bodies that are living here, can we become more interactive and start looking out a bit more? And start seeing.
But it's a bit like the character in the game, like the character in the computer game realizing it's just a bunch of pixels.
Yes.
and being aware of the guy on the joystick, you know, like.
Yes. Who's playing me?
But in computer terms, you know, that's not programmed into it. You know, that the computer game can't become self-aware, can it? I don't know. Is there possibilities in the future where even programmers create computer games where they become self-aware? I mean, why not?
One of the more interesting people I've run into on the little astral trips, we mentioned previously, referred to her as experienced architect girl. And we said before, she's a woman whose age is more than David's and Ian's combined age. But if you get to meet her, she looks quite young. She's in the body that looks like 18 to 20 years old. That's how young she looks, but she's full of worldly wisdom. And having already done a stint at being a mom and things like that, she's now into generating not computer games, but life experience game like things and scenarios. And she helps generate them and create them, and then other friends and people can go and play at them too. So she does actually create them. And she's out there and happy to interact with anyone who wants to do it. And she's also a very handy person to link with because she'll help you link up. She'll actually help stabilize you and get the connection up and running so you can start to see into her world, get a portal up and running.
So my next question is, when you see this stuff, so obviously with astral projection, you talk about a form of light astral projection versus the traditional heavy astral projection. So it's the kind of the heavy astral projection that I've experienced. And when I experience that, it's fully vivid 360-degree reality. You know, it's like being here right now. You experience it for real.
Well,
but if I try to the light one, it's more what a clairvoyant maybe see. It's very dark. My mind's dark, and I just get flashes and things like that. But have you developed it to a stage where you visualize it more as a vivid astral experience?
So here's what I was doing that comes back to the story of parallel Armageddon, David. We got quite good at the light astral projection and doing quite a lot with that, which is more that sort of clairvoyant version of it. But to find out more about the Armageddon worlds, David was given the little challenge of really climbing into him. So for that, needed to do a much heavier astral projection. And we're finding on that one, the most convenient time for that experiment was late in the evening. And if you get to bed with the right degree of cheerfulness, and sort of awakeness, could then hit that little zone when you're nearly asleep and start to fall into it. And it was a bit like trying to play a fuzzy tape multiple times. So it was a bit fuzzy, get into it, a bit fuzzy, get to it, just kept replaying it, and building up the elements, which was taking months to do. And out of that, I was able to sort of pick up what the experience was like of being in Dublin on a Friday night at ground zero when the lights go out and what happens next. And what it's like to have a bomb literally going off behind you. And the answer is you don't remember much, actually.
No. So, yeah, because obviously when you come back from an astral projection, you have to write it up quick, don't you? I do.
And so I could find from a heavy projection what the memories were like driving along in a car when something goes off behind you, but then needed a more clairvoyant approach to see what happened whilst that David had lapsed into a more unconscious zone. So I had to sort of look from another camera angle to see what had happened. And then when it recovered consciousness, we could get back into it again and sort of see and feel through what had happened to him, what had to be done. And he found himself getting out of a smashed car onto a road that was burning his feet. It had been so heated by the heat of the nuclear blast behind him.
Yeah.
It was a tremendous thing. He'd been flash blinded as he was driving away by the nuclear flash. Even though he's going the other direction, it was so bright. It had rendered him blind. And there was a bit of traffic coming in the opposite direction, and someone else had just at that moment swerves in front of him, caused his car to flip. So the David's car was caused to flip over. And he was really lucky because this was, what do you call it? An April showers kind of an evening. And he'd driven under an April shower shortly before, and some of that cloud caught the first blast of light. And as the incredibly intense nuclear flash got through, it burnt through the cloud. But in those split seconds of time, he found himself in a situation where he was in a car that was literally flipping over onto its back. So instead of being in a car where you just get roasted by intense heat, the underside of his car got roasted. The wet underside of a car.
Right.
And what David got there was a minor burn. The back of his hand burnt. In particular, it got that about the only body part that was caught in the worst of the heat. So a bit of burning to that. And then as the car flipped over, it just the underside of it took the
protected. Yeah.
Took that heat wave. I mean, it'd make a great movie if we did a modern special effect. It's like, he just got there. And car ended up on its feet the right way round, and it's like waking up in this smashed car lying over sort of part in the sort of driver's side, part on the passenger side. Broken glass all over the place, your hearing's being affected, everything's quite warm. You've gone from this city that was in darkness to now one where there's lots of little orange fires burning all over the place. Climbing out of the wreckage, your car is gone. And you're now in an area that's going to become a firestorm. It's going to catch fire because there's little fires burning everywhere. And when you look around into things like cars beside you, they've already burst into flame beside them, so there's bodies in them, burning bodies around the place. And by the way, the scene there is not like a narrow road, it's like dual carriageway where he'd got to just on the outskirts of Dublin going westwards. That's how far he'd reached at that point. And when he got out of the car, he suddenly found that the road was too hot to walk on and had to jump into the boot of his car, literally take refuge in that for a moment to stop his feet getting any more scalded. So fire's burning, and because he's training, he knew that one bomb going off doesn't mean that's the end of it. You've got to start getting out of there. So he literally had to think, got to get out of here, but how to do it, because we're in a survival situation. And he's thinking enough that he put a coat with an anorak over his head. He's doing building work at the time and had things like builder's gloves and a few goggles, bits of masks and stuff, and literally dressed himself up as much as he could, because he started to have to get out through a firestorm. Because as he was walking out, the fire's burning more and more, at which point then a second detonation went off behind him again. He was able to take cover better this time. The worst of the light was taken up by the smoke of the blast, but he found himself okay from the blast that came, and the light wasn't too bad because of all the smoke in the air, so he didn't get blinded. But as the backdraft came, he found himself sort of hiding in a little sort of alcove at the side of the road, with bits of burning debris of cardboard and wood and God knows what being sucked back at him. So if you can imagine lying behind a small wall and there's burning debris being pulled back at you and thrown at you in backdraft, it's like being at a barbecue with someone throwing all the hot coals at you. It's like, so anyway, after that, he decided to try and run as he could, sort of running a bit, again with more of the backdraft had built up because the firestorm was getting worse, and it's like running through was it sort of dual carriageway with not too many buildings to the side, but there's just so much burning material around, and the firestorm was building and pulling all the burning debris back in towards the centre of Dublin, and he just kept going until he got out of the burning area. All the time again, he was like the last guy out at that point. If there were other survivors, they got ahead of him.
Yeah, yeah.
The last person. What's the feel of this as I described?
Well, it's like a movie. It sounds like a Hollywood movie, and obviously he was very lucky to survive, and he obviously had the right things happen at the right time of the car flipping, and had the right things on him to make the right decision. So, was there an element of luck there, do you think, or do you think even in that life there was more opportunity?
Everyone else died. All the other parallels died.
Exactly, yeah.
That's what happened to them. There were a number of other parallel guys, like the guy at home that night with the parents couldn't get them out fast enough. The only survivor was the one who dumped his girlfriend when she laughed at him because she thought he was an idiot.
So what happened on that day in this timeline? Did anything significant happen on that day here, or just a normal summer's evening?
The timelines had already separated at that point.
Right.
So it wasn't like, today we nearly had World War III. Nothing like that. When we looked at this one, we found the timelines had already separated, and a number of events that happened in the Armageddon world had happened before they'd happened in this world. So that girlfriend, it was probably about a year or two later in this world before we met her. In that world, to pack it all in, you'd edited out a few less important bits, it seems, shoved it all together.
Yeah.
So in this world, at the time that seemed to have happened, my car was in a crash repair in Wales due to a little altercation with a bull in Wales. So it wouldn't be much use as a getaway vehicle in that world. Didn't have that car crash, and there was the car when it was acquired. Admittedly, it still ended up smashed up.
So
little differences.
A lot of differences. So any future, like if you could, I mean, I don't know if it's possible to look into the future now to see, is there possible things like that lined up? But even if you were a future David in the future, looking back, you're potentially looking back at different parallels anyway. Like how you'd have to tap into the future one, which is you now. But even that future one you tap into now could be a different future you, because you've made different choices.
Let's go back to this. If we see the parallel plus versions of ourselves doing something smart, we can copy it. And all we really need to do to copy it is notice their energetic alignment that they've plugged into. Because it's rather like we connect ourselves into different energetic alignments. It's like running a different channel on the TV. If we see they're watching something on channel 6 and we've got lost in some stupid boring film on channel 342, we could plug into channel 6 and start connecting to that story, connecting to that energy flows. And when you connect to that, your body starts to behave in a different way. We can start to channel that energy flow and manifest things in a better way. And this gives us, what I said at the beginning, an element of free will. It's not full out free will. We're selecting, rather like going off a menu in a restaurant or box of chocolates, which chocolate will you have, but you are exercising a preference for which one you'd like to do. And there's a question back to this, Ian. Are there any preferences in principle he'd like to play with? Because I wonder if there's a parallel version of him who's already doing it.
Well, my parallel one, I'd like to have more time to to explore this rather than working so hard. I feel like I'm a workaholic, really, but I don't want to be a workaholic. I just feel like I'm happy when I work. I'll be honest. When I've had times of not working, I felt very down. You know what I mean? I feel like I have to be busy. But I would love to be more busy in doing things I enjoy, I guess. I think most people would, wouldn't they, really?
Well, when you're saying that, you're pulling that parallel nearer. It's a bit like pulling something nearer. And what you're generating is a version of Ian who's running his own his own online TV channel. And the sacrifice you have to make is there's loads of tricky people to deal with. And this version of Ian is happier with fewer people to handle. That version of Ian is much more comfortable dealing with multiple relationships and awkward, tiresome creatives. But they're great fun. So I can, as you're talking about it, I can feel it exists, but you're blocking me. You're not even breathing when we're talking about it.
No.
So when I'm talking about it, you are pulling in another direction, almost the other way.
Yeah.
Can you feel how your body does?
Well, when you're talking about that thing about dealing with lots of that kind of makes me knot up completely because
can you feel how
yeah
there is a version of Ian that's learned how to handle them?
Yeah, there's a version of that, I'm sure, but not here. I prefer to.
Well, that's because you're not lining into it. Do you want to try it for a second? Just breathing a bit better. And perhaps in this conversation, we can just get a feel of how he does it. Firstly, how much do you have to stabilize yourself to come back into line? How much do you have to stabilize? So the parallel Ian with its own, it's like a TV station, but it's online stuff. No antenna or broadcast mast. What sort of personality does he demonstrate during the day that copes with these people? Just relax and breathe nicely, and you'll just find you can slide in. How does he do it? What thoughts? Or observations, I should say.
Well, the only impression I got there really, I was starting to feel lighter in myself actually. But I don't know if he's sort of a similar character as the zany guy you're talking about. Whether he's someone who just didn't really care about what people thought, maybe. I don't know.
I agree with that. Yeah, I agree with that. If you didn't care what people thought, how much could you act out different personalities merely as a way of handling people?
Well, yeah, I mean, you could have a persona for different situations, I guess. But that's what we're building rapport is with people, isn't it? You sort of respond to someone based on their. So if you're dealing with someone who's just like a complete zany
let's
nutter,
go back. I want you to relax again, and I'd like you to have a look at what kind of personas this fellow employs. Just relax again. Lie them breathe through, because you need to get this in relaxed and almost like neutral. And when we're being neutral, we can start to pick up what the other version of Ian is like. What kind of personas does he exhibit in order to function in that parallel?
Well, I've got a really tall guy with a bald head up here who seems quite like a protector personality.
Bodyguard you're talking about. So that was trick one. Have a big bald bodyguard.
Am I making it up? I don't know. I just saw that. I don't know whether that's true or not, but I just kind of felt like a.
Well, it wasn't Ian there. It wasn't.
No.
You're just looking out. What's the first thing you saw?
Yeah, I don't know. I just saw this tall bald man.
Yeah.
What was that? I don't know.
That was a bodyguard.
I don't know. You put me on the spot a bit. I don't know how if I'm picking it up or not. It seems
you're picking up bits of it.
Yeah.
You're a bit like a guy who someone said, "Here's a 1,000-piece puzzle," and you've probably got about 3 or 4 bits in your hand. You go, "There's a red bit, and a green bit." So again, breathe through, and just stabilize. Okay. Now, the next bit, you're not quite breathing through as comfortably as you wanted yet, because I sort of looked at it, and I'll just talk through what I saw. In this slide, Ian likes being quite an easygoing, chatty guy, a lot of laugh, a lot of fun, and a lot of relaxing. Let's call him the TV station parallel guy. He shouts at people a lot and puts on the outer persona of being angry, but does it as a bit of a game. And the game is he finds it really funny to do that, because he's found he can get quite good work out of people. Prodding them. But in this world, the current Ian would feel that energy is a bit too difficult to handle, so he's a much more light-hearted guy in this world.
Yeah. Well, I can imagine why he would do that personality. With the kind of the bodyguard or the outgoing, shouty one, you're basically not giving everyone a chance to come in and subvert you, if you like. You're kind of overpowering the situation straight away. So you're becoming a bit of like an alpha technique, isn't it? Where in this life, I would never deploy that technique at all. I'd always kind of analyze someone first and work them out.
Well, this guy was, I feel he's quite sharp at working them out. And then he'd figure out how to give them a push into doing their best, even if they grumbled about how they were got to do it. You can feel how we're getting near him, but you're blocking up as we're going near it. You're going, I can't do that.
It's kind of a few miles away, or I don't know, even a million miles away. But I kind of I've always struggled with employing people. You know, I'm kind of the person who would rather do it myself than employing people. You know what I mean? I think about employing someone, or I think about commissioning a freelancer to help me or whatever. And in the end, I always come back to, actually, I'll just do it myself. It'd be like a whole lot easier. And then I end up just taking it all on and doing too much. But obviously, from that perspective, it's harder to scale. You can't really scale up, can you? So you sort of end up just... I make up my mind in the end and go, you know what, I'm happier just controlling it myself. You know, I'm not, there's no big surprises. You're kind of doing it yourself. So, but maybe he was equipped early on or experiences early on to sort of adapt to that kind of persona to where I am right now. So,
well, we'd have to have a look some more at him at some later point, because I'm sure you'd like to at least know what he did, to know how it's done.
Oh yeah,
what did he do?
I'd be intrigued to know how he diverged. So what in his personality diverged?
Well, I'm not being let in at the moment. Remembering one thing, I've sort of shown stuff, and the team that work with Ian are saying, not yet. We want to leave him hungry on this, and we want to leave him curious. So that's the end up to that. One thing that would be nice to do is everyone, as far as possible, and I have to knock off my phone here because my lovely wife wanted to call. She wanted to know where husband got to. She's alive in this lifetime, and she's living the Armageddon world. She's in mourning now and very unhappy, and that'll probably kill her, to be fair. We looked ahead. The kids will be all right. They're a bit older than they are in this world. And we did look clairvoyantly, and there were relationships ahead of them. But the guy we'd like to send a little connect to is sort of the parallel version of David, who's now passed over to the heavens. And for anyone who's watching this particular show, they might get a little impression of how he looks like in ghost form, because he'll be hanging around there. And it's, if anything, his bit of work when he was getting near the end of his life, because it's quite a hard life that he was living in, so it wore his body out. He was getting near the end. It was making a bit of projection easier. He did manage to look in on some other versions of David, got to see this guy, looked at my home, where I lived, the family. We compared notes. We had fun like that. And then he passed over. So we sent him a little bit of a thanks for taking the time at the end of his life to look in and stimulate us, to ask some questions and broaden our horizons and look at a bigger picture and find some new things. So just let's send him a bit of love and light to help his passing. And again, you might get some little impression, and anyone who's watching this recording, you do it to, you might get an impression of what that parallel Armageddon David was like. Now he's passed on. And a little bit, and he thanks you all.
Got it. So would he be a ghost though, or would it be just in the astrals now? What do you think? Do you know the answer to that?
What impression do you get?
I wouldn't have thought there'd be a ghost for some reason. If he was doing astral projection, he would already know.
He'd realise what was happening.
Yeah.
And when I've done that, this with people who quite practice this as well, we found he's made it out of the lower levels.
And I can imagine, because obviously the astral there would be very heavy on what happened as well.
Yeah,
there'd be quite a thick element to go through. A lot of people, a lot of survivors would be working their way up through it, wouldn't they? Yeah.
It's a fascinating place to look at. And here's the weird thing. In many ways, it's more compelling to look at the Armageddon world than it is to look at our more advanced parallel plus versions.
Well, yeah, and this is
a dilemma.
So yeah, some of you, we'll knock off in a second, but I mean, in your books, you say about this: the harder the lives are, or the more vivid the drama is the contrast that the higher being needs, the super consciousness really needs. If things are too easy, it's a bit like if people go into if you went into a Big Brother house, if you like, but it's being recorded, you're there, everyone's watching you. Most people are going to be more contrived, they're not really being genuine. Some of them might get lost in it. You do see some characters in that get lost in it, don't you? But I don't think most of them are really going to be their true selves, are they?
That's because they're being scrutinized by judgmental people.
Yeah.
And if you've got your own perfume brand or fashion line to flog afterwards, you want to put on a good show.
A good show, that's right. But likewise, if you come in here and know everything, you know why you're here instantly. You may not have such a drive to play the game. You might. I think you mentioned it. Like I maybe wouldn't have gone into a corporate job. I probably would have seeked out a more spiritual path earlier on, and maybe
you needed to prove you could do a corporate job just to tick that off.
But it gave me skills. It definitely gave me IT skills I never would have learned. But maybe I would have learned them a different way. I don't know.
Look at this. You described something rather well. You said like the Big Brother house, and the cameras are watching you. And I said in the Big Brother house, it's full of people scrutinizing you who are going to be judgmental and might be your customers for your celebrity fashion or perfume line. What we'll find is if we pay attention to who's watching us, there's a whole support team of other beings out there who are actually helping you to live in this world. And something I think we mentioned in the previous video, we're in a world that's so low down. On our own, we can't really connect out. We do need that support team to help us out. So instead of very judgmental beings, it's incredibly helpful beings who want to assist you and give you some extra skills for this life. So like the Big Brother household, but a brilliant audience who also want to come in and join you and help you and come into your physical form and live this world.
Well, that's the perfect way to end the show, David, today.